Thank you for coming, everybody. My name is Kevin Williamson. I'm a professional wargamer at this point. I spent the last 2 years at Marine Corps University, prior service Army, prior service Naval Reserves. I've done some consulting work for CSIS. I'm involved in Fight Club International. I've got my own nonprofit that just offers free wargaming exposure courses. And I'm currently now the engagement manager for a company called Battle Road, which has their own modeling and sim platform. So tonight, like Sebastian alluded to, I'm going to be talking about interactive tactical decision games. I don't anticipate this taking up the full 90 minutes, so we're going to have a large portion at the end for Q&A. This was a presentation I gave at Connections US, so if you were there and you listened in on that talk, it's largely going to be most of the same content, but I have added some additional information since then. So again, just kind of going over some of my professional background, not too important, but if you want the slides later, you can get them. And because I'm deathly afraid of public speaking, I always put dogs in my presentation. So these are 3 animals in my life. So we're going to talk about tactical decision games. And I don't have a degree. I don't claim to be extremely knowledgeable on the subject to a research level, but I am just going to kind of talk about the conceptual framework of what the new tactical decision game in my mind is. But the basis of a tactical decision game is it's a situational exercise, or at its core, it's just a situation. And it's driven by a narrative. And this is all going to be in the military context when it comes to wargaming. So it's a narrative that provides basic mission, intent, resources available. So it's just describing to the person reading it what resources, capabilities they have at their disposal, and what their condition is, how many troops they have, the status, things of that nature. But they've been used throughout history, dating back to before the 1800s. They came out of Prussia, essentially, and used them for contingency planning and tactical assignments. And one of the most obvious benefits is that they require little in resources. If you have a pencil and a piece of paper, you can go through a tactical decision game as long as the person who's administering that game has the knowledge and what they're talking about. But it's a very low effort way to kind of do some additional training. And so what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, I wanted to give proper credit, is actually an idea that I credit Brendan McBreen with actually coming up with, even though he was looking at it for a different purpose. But he's a career infantry officer. He served 27 years in the Marine Corps, and he currently works at Marine Corps intelligence schools. And he really cares about Marines and training Marines. And he did a wonderful document called 300 Assaults. The rifle squad assault is part of the platoon attack. And essentially that document was driven by, he wanted to know if I needed to tell Marines how to conduct, I think it was a squad assault, where do I go to tell them the proper way to conduct that? And so, in this paper, he talks about Marines fight like they are trained. They look at manuals, they, look at training standards, they go through schools, they go to exercises, live fire training, things like that. And so he looked, he says, is it in the manual? Is it in the Marine Rifle Squad manual? And he found it does not explain how to conduct a squad assault. He looked at the training standards, he looked at the schoolhouses, and he said, yes, schoolhouses teach different assault techniques, but they don't teach, a basic fundamental squad assault. So he looked at the exercises, unit training, combat, and he ultimately came to the same conclusion. There isn't really a good answer to tell one Marine on the West Coast when a Marine on the East Coast might be doing a completely different thing. So he said, how can we look to see what the best way is to conduct a squad assault? And he said, in simulation. He said, we can simulate an infantry assault on a computer over and over again. General Berger, the commandant, has stated, wargaming needs to be used to fill our greatest deficiency in training. Practice and decision-making against a thinking enemy. Wargaming gives leaders reps and sets in realistic combat decision-making. So that's what he did. He ended up using a computer simulation called Combat Mission. And I think he used Shock Force 2, or it may have been Shock Force 1, but the theater is largely the same. And so he basically conducted 300 assaults. He set up multiple different scenarios within combat mission and manually Monte Carloed each scenario for 300 assaults to kind of figure out, you know, if I have these parameters or if the enemy's in a well entrenched position versus out in the open, he went through all those things. And so I've listed some of the examples of the actual data that he goes through. Um, so he looks at 400 meters, what does it look like versus 200 meters versus 100 meters? What does it look like versus conscripts with automatic rifles manning a fighting hole versus just out in the open? What does it look like with conscripts with a machine gun? What if they're well trained with just automatic rifles? So he went through this over and over and over again to try to find a good baseline standard. And so he was looking at it from the standpoint of how do I get data so that I can inform my Marines on the best way to conduct, a squad assault if they ask me that question. And what I looked at was essentially he just created the new tactical decision game in my eyes. That if a career infantry officer who more than likely wasn't a war gamer his entire life, or maybe he didn't have time for it in his day job, decided that wargaming ultimately was a tool that he needed to use for his day job so that he could better inform Marines. It just kind of struck me as a unique perspective that I wanted to dive into. And so when I was at MCU, the biggest problem was time constraints, was how do I get the students at MCU to want to war game? And a large portion of it was I just don't have time because they're either writing papers or they have families, their time's limited, um, or they would give it a shot if it didn't take 4 hours to go through an entire game and get something out of it. So I took some of the simulations at MCU that we had, and I created basically automatic play scenarios where all they had to do was fire it up and select which COA they wanted to happen and give them some agency over the variables. So what I'm about to go through now is an interactive tactical decision game using the same simulation that Brendan McBreen used, except I gave it to US Fight Club. And I used Combat Mission Cold War. And, it's a pre-built scenario. I didn't put any effort into making a custom one, but I just laid out the variables for them. I gave them the information, told them what they had in their, available resources. And then I asked for, based on the screenshots I gave you, mark up a basic COA, and then let's test them inside a combat mission. And so I got all different kinds of orders without them ever having to touch the simulation. They didn't need to learn how to play combat mission. They basically just looked at pictures, looked at information, looked at a situation, and gave me a basic mission order. So these are different examples. And I specifically said it doesn't have to be doctrinal. It can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to kind of remove the barrier to entry for somebody who was like, I want to participate, but maybe that's not my career field or my MOS. And so this is one of the most basic ones, which works. They tell me at the very bottom how they want the sequencing. And then as a facilitator, you just kind of use your best judgment, to make sure that things that they would naturally do, you do, even if they don't specify. And then one of the examples here, which I really wanted to highlight, won't name the individual for privacy reasons because I didn't ask him if I could say who he is, but this is a service member who's an officer, and he uses wargaming to do some professional development in his free time with members of his unit and on his own. And this was the COA that he gave me. And so he's playing the Red Force, and here he is basically doing an enemy analysis based on the parameters and variables. And then he's giving me a very good COA here. He's giving me sectors of fire. He's telling me the overlay orders. He's telling me recon and isolation. He's telling me what each element's doing and at what phase. And again, this is without having that service member ever having to touch the simulation. They don't have to worry about watching a YouTube video in their free time to learn how to play. You just take a couple screenshots, you give them the scenario, and then you run it inside of a simulation. So the reason why I think this is a little bit more valuable as a training tool than analog TDGs is as we go into Force Design 2030 stuff, South China Sea, or any near peer competitor, having a discussion about what may or may not happen in that situation is valuable. But unless anybody in the room has experience in those situations, I think simulation can just kind of help inform those discussions. Not saying that combat mission would get the Cold War scenario here right more than a TDG would, but more so it could give you some valuable data to add to that discussion. It can actually tell you how many rounds you may expend. It may tell you what your casualties would look like. It may tell you how long it would actually take you to traverse that distance. You could change the weather. You could make the field muddy. You could do a whole lot of different things and get data that inform that discussion. This was supposed to be a video, I think, but it's not working. Oh, no, here's the video. Okay. Let's see if it'll play. All right. So this was just a demo of one of the COAs. So it's nothing really special, but it's just to kind of show you, okay. And I'm commentating on the video, but I've got it muted right now. But it's just to show you how you could maybe do like an after action video, in the span of 4 minutes, just kind of throw something quick together to show people how their COA actually played out. And then here we've got some fire and maneuver happening. And then at the end, you get some, statistics, casualty rates, whether or not you got the objective, things like that. So that's one example. The other thing I did, and this was at MCU specifically, was Command PE. I'm sure most of the people in this, presentation or those watching are going to know Command PE, which is a really great tool. It's not easy to learn. It's not easy asking students to devote hours and hours, days and weeks even, to trying to learn the software to play. So it ends up being this tool that nobody really touches. So I wanted to find a way to still use it. And so there were two ways. The first way isn't really relevant, but we ended up using it for thesis papers. We'd have students tell us, okay, well, would you mind setting this up and Monte Carloing it? So it's valuable for that. But then we ended up doing a little bit of this, which is called a rapid decision game. But there's a menu inside of Command called Special Actions, which you can just code through Lua to do preset things. And so all I've done here is we looked at anti-ballistic missile defense of Japan. And all the student needs to do here is basically click what they want to defend Japan and what kind of ballistic missiles they want North Korea to fire. And most of the actions are repeatable. So whether you wanted to launch as many just to see how many it would take to overwhelm, or you wanted to run it multiple times, it's perfectly doable. So it's a way to make, a TDG in a digital sense that's interactive for the student, and they don't have to learn how to play the game. This is another example. So this is also a combat mission. This is also that service member I mentioned earlier. He ends up printing out some of these maps. And like I said, for professional development purposes, or he'll take them to their units or to his unit and do some training there. So you could even turn this into like an analog product at your unit, just printing out the maps and then running it inside of the sim, getting the data, and then maybe having a monthly discussion. Think about putting up one of these interactive TDGs, at the battalion footprint or something, maybe give a little reward for whoever gets the best score, and at the end of the month, you can come out with all this data, and some engagement. This was another example. So previously I worked for Matrix ProSims, and I was in talks with Marine Corps Association to start converting their Marine Corps Gazette TDGs into digital simulations as a way to kind of, you know, in parallel with what MC was doing with the cloud, kind of take wargaming that next step further. It didn't get off its feet because since then I've transitioned, obviously, but this is a perfect example of some of those TDGs that people in the room might not have direct experience with to be able to say this would happen or this wouldn't happen. And so this was a specific one where what would you do if somebody's wounded, sick, and they need to get off the X in one of these expeditionary advanced basing options, but you've got, PRC vessels off the coast monitoring. Do you radio for help? How soon would an Osprey get there? So you're actually able to kind of get some of these, even search and rescue data that you may not get just from a discussion. This is kind of like a bigger example. So this is where I'm knowledge deficient, probably. I've looked for like an operational version of what a TDG is. I could have swore I heard something called a case decision game, but apparently that's not a thing. But I was exploring, and this is kind of like the idea of like how would you create a TDG, but on an operational level for like maybe a logistician, right? Or somebody who's maybe their job is looking at the bigger picture just because they're connected to that network in a way that, a company commander or a battalion commander might not be. So it's just another example of other digital modeling and simulation software. And this one specifically can give you like logistics data that maybe combat mission or command PE couldn't as easily. And so now I'm on to the next section that wasn't at connections, but you may be asking yourself, Kevin, that's great, but I don't know anything about digital wargaming. Where do I look? So there's a fantastic resource that was made by a gentleman called Peter Robbins, who's involved with US Fight Club. And I also want to say he's doing some stuff for the Marine Corps Association, but I'm not entirely sure. He ended up making a great COTS Wargaming guide. COTS just means commercial off the shelf. It means that you could go somewhere and buy it today if you, excuse me, you could go and buy it somewhere today if you wanted to. He's geared this guide specifically towards armed service and officer candidate school fight club use, so like extracurricular stuff. But it's perfect because it goes through everything like if you didn't want to do a TDG, but maybe you wanted to look at doing a staff exercise on your own, it kind of goes over some basic information on that. But what's really good is it gives you some of these digital games. It has tabletop in there as well, but this is a really good digital resource to start with. If you're looking at maybe picking some things up off Steam and kind of messing around at your unit or, just taking it wherever, it'll tell you not just the description of the game, but approachability. How complex is it? And then he tries to give some use cases. And if there's any facilitator tips, he'll try to give those as well. And the last thing that I'm going to end with is, in my opinion, and this is kind of more of an opinion based than it is, let me educate you topic. I think that with open source communities like Fight Club International, and then the emergence of tech like generative AI, large language models, there's some risks, right? And so because I don't know who's exactly listening to the presentation, I don't want anyone to just start creating like communities on Discord for TDGs openly, or however you might think about doing it. So I just kind of want to give you some risks, associated with that. And so this is just kind of like an example of some of the staff X's that go on at Fight Club International. So we try to stick to mostly Cold War 80s stuff for this reason, right? So the further back in time you can go, if you're going to do it as like a PME after hours thing, maybe on an open source platform, would be to kind of take it back a little bit further in time. And maybe don't upload, like there's nothing in here that's classified, right? But just some best practices is maybe don't like record your meetings and upload them in channels that everybody can download. Because there are Chinese companies out there that are exploring doing things open source and taking all of those inputs. And it's just another example of just the amount of communication that could go on in a wargaming platform. And then this just kind of explains how I see those technologies kind of meshing together for bad actors to kind of take advantage of. And then I'm bad at naming things, so it's like the onion of risk, which is the most vulnerable are those open source online wargaming communities, because there's probably a fair chance that there's already people lurking just because of the overlap of professional backgrounds that are there. And then if digital wargaming does start getting more popular and more accessible to more communities, it could have these second and third order effects of trickling into PME, academia, so on and so forth. And again, that's just my opinion. It may never happen, but it's just things that I think we should be cognizant and aware of. And so what? So the bottom line of this whole presentation is there are digital wargaming platforms out there that are commercially available. They're usually between 60 to $80. You can get some of the older ones on sale for like 20 bucks, sometimes even cheaper. Um, and it's very, I would say it's a very low effort facilitation cost in order to be able to provide maybe some more engaging training to your unit or organization. If you're already a war gamer and you're already familiar with having to learn, digital simulations, I just see it as another tool in our toolbox instead of trying to convince people to sit down and learn how to play the game. What if we kind of made some almost like a solitaire rule set, if you will, for some of these digital scenarios? And that's all I have. So I'll open it up to Q&A.
So thanks for the presentation, Kevin. So I have a couple questions already, but I encourage others to toss in their questions right away. So the first question we have is we tell officers and NCOs on our war game course that war games are repeatable, not replicable. For example, every turn through a game is a one-off. Both sides will probably change their plans if you get them to replay a few times to improve the result or plan. There, therefore, cannot be the best COA or most deadly enemy COA because that can change on one branch, right? What do you think can guard against the search for the perfect solution in these TDGs?
So I think so the way that I'll just talk about the way that I conducted it and envisioned it, which is instead of the searching for a perfect solution, I would usually just have people, it would be a monthly thing. So I would do one a month. I would display it at the beginning of the month, and then they'd have 3 weeks to send me a COA. Then I run it through the sim, and then they never see their COA. They never get graded. What ends up happening is two things. I ended up picking like what I thought was the most interesting one and recording it, but the way that I would have done it if I had the resources is create short videos of highlights for each individual submission, um, and either send it to them that way and then go on to the next one, or make it like a group seminar session where maybe instead of each individual COA, it's a team effort. And maybe you've got two cells, or maybe you have one cell, and you're asking them, hey, as a team, you guys come up with this COA. And then they just play it turn by turn. Um, that's kind of also where I kind of saw the generative AI coming into digital wargaming, which is the real bottleneck here is the facilitator and the resources the facilitator has. Because we would all love to be able to make 50 scenarios a week, and then you'd be able to satisfy those one-offs. But that's kind of where I see generative AI coming in the future, is being able to just mass produce scenarios based on your inputs.
So the next question is, why the fascination with the Cold War stuff? There are a ton of real historical fights, rather than the hypothetical War III Tom Clancy stuff. Uh,
I agree with you. I'm actually not a Cold War nerd. I just personally, I don't find the period interesting, but I think it's just because a lot of people in Fight Club find it interesting for the Tom Clancy-esque feel. But you're totally right. Like at MCU, and this is unclassified, so I can talk about it. We do the Gothic line, at least while I was there, every year, which is an Italian World War II fight. And that one's really interesting from an operational point of view. I don't think there's definitely never any pushback or friction towards going with the other eras. I think what it is it's just the people who are willing to put in the work, because most of these organizations, it is all volunteers. Um, they'd rather kind of work on the things that they're interested in, because it's almost like being a dungeon master of a D&D campaign, or at least I kind of feel that way when I make a scenario and somebody plays it. Um, but yeah, if you have ideas, like Fight Club's a great, I know I just talked about the risks, right? But if you're trying to go back in time more, like Fight Club's a great place. If you just say, hey, I'm interested in doing this, the organization is at a point now where they'll actually like support you and start scheduling like a time frame to be able to work on that collaboratively.
So before we shift topics, I know you have the great slide with Robinson's like slide deck. Do you have a link for people in the chat? Just because I want to ask for it.
Yeah, so I don't have it on me right now. Actually, I can, but I have to stop presenting. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'll grab that link real quick and send it in the chat.
So while Kevin is working his internet magic for everyone's dying need to know, um, are there any other questions in the chat? I know I'm tracking one real quick. Is this is slightly off topic, but has anyone ever translated the Chinese 36 stratagems into military speak and the examples as well? I'm assuming in the form of like a TDG.
Uh, I don't know that, to be honest. Yeah.
And to David's question or comment about like Cold War stuff, I know sometimes Cold War stuff is used to avoid classification problems, but also to still have them incorporate things like, surface radar, modern S capabilities, like CAP and missile warfare and so forth. So there's a couple different reasons you do that, but again, I think you should always just do real world stuff, but that's just me. Um,
Yeah.
Prior to World War II, the Marine Corps planned out island hopping campaign, sort of. Is anything being done with the Chinese situation, Kevin?
Say that last part one more time. I heard
Is it?
island hopping.
Yeah. So prior to World War II, the Marine Corps planned out hopping campaign. Is there anything being done in regards to the Chinese situation? I'll let you take that, Kevin.
Um, Maybe some clarification on like what's being done. I
I
should
think.
clarify, like I'm not like in the know, and if I was, I wouldn't even say it anyways. Um, like obviously there's wargaming of the South China Sea going on currently. Um, and I have faith that the people who are making those decisions have the information, I guess is how I'd put it.
Yeah, I'll leave it there. I would say there's a lot of good PME wargaming happening, and there's a renaissance in that regard.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that. Um, So next question I'm trying to figure out, how do you get buy-in? Air Force veteran here working with a pilot tactical decision making, but generally wargaming only really gets pushed by wargaming hobbits. I am a hobbit, I guess. So there's little consistency in rules, so there tends to be little trust in wargaming as a training tool.
Yes, that's a good question. It's not one that has a solid answer to, I feel. So like there's a couple different ways to tackle that, I think. It depends on what you're looking at using this for. So if you're looking at using pilot tactical decision making, it may be making some interesting TDGs for that. If I was if I was faculty director for a day, right? These are very easy homework assignments to assign, for extra credit or whatever the regulations are to come up with some fancy way to incentivize it. And I know it's a dead horse, but just in the same way that we incentivize maxing out your PT score. Um, I don't know what the reward looks like, but that's one way to make it optional, extra, and incentivize people to maybe check it out. Another way is, again, I'm from like the way lower enlisted side background, so all I can really reference is sergeant's time training, which I never really experienced during my time. I don't know if it was a unit thing or if it just kind of faded out of, time by the time I got in, but there's an example of sergeant's time training. It's probably a little different in the Air Force when you're speaking of pilots, but um, I'm sure you're familiar with DCS, but maybe if you made like a workup video inside of, DCS, just looking at an after action review video or something like that. The buy-in is difficult. It's very hard to try to convince people who aren't wargamers to get into it, especially if they don't think that there's value for their job. Um, the last point that I'll try to make is I try to just beat it beat it into people at MCU. Like I even did a breakfast club where I was there at 07 every morning. So the students saw us with the table as soon as they came in the lobby. Like, it's a lot of work. But yeah, it's just hard. There's not a solid answer. I wish I could give you one. Sorry.
One slight comment is there are Air Force or air power centric TDGs, like the Marine Corps Gazette used to do a couple of them. And they usually just focus on like snap judgments. Like I remember running one for my Georgetown students where you're like the pilot lead of a sortie and you get like comms denied and you have to make a series of choices of what you're going to do according to your mission and the threat that you last got and those kind of things, right? And walk through your own logic of how from the pilot seat why you're making certain decisions. Um, Beyond like sort of like you're in the fighter t tactic pilot sort of thing, but that can sort of rub against it as well. So that's another way as well. Um, as I search for other questions in the chat for a little bit and allow people to put in more questions, is what are some tips you would give for people who are thinking about employing interactive TDGs, resources that you use that you haven't mentioned previously or want to emphasize for the crowd here?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with digital wargaming, I would say don't try to start, you know, and go all out. I would just start small and just see like who bites. And this is speaking from like a PME side of the house. If you're just trying to integrate it, I would start small. I would create a very small scenario, and then, whether it's during lunchtime or maybe after a class or something, just find a way to inject that scenario somehow. Whether it's like the way that we did it at MCU is we just try to build this culture of, Fight Club and try to give raffles and prizes. And there were some discussions about, having them get recognized by the organization at the end of the year. So if you're a facilitator or a faculty member and you're trying to bring it to your organization, I would say try to have those discussions with your leadership first. Because unless the leadership kind of back you on the idea, even if it's just a little support to kind of nudge students towards it, it's going to be a really uphill battle. Tips I would give you for facilitation learning the products, though, is because they're commercially available, YouTube is a great resource. Combat mission, you can learn if you just watch a YouTube video, probably within an hour or two, depending on, how used to computer games you are. Most of the other ones, there's some simple hex and counter ones out there that you can learn pretty easily. But I would say, yeah, just look at YouTube if you're trying to look at how to actually use them. Because a lot of the guides that people make because they play the game to play the game are actually really beneficial if you're using them for professional use cases.
One thing I wanted to highlight is David Redpath also said the Hornet Leader series um, is also like sort of from that pilot-oriented perspective, part of the Squadron Leader series, which is a commercially available game that sort of has like air power at the tactical level. Another is like Birds of Prey, which is a more complicated system, but it does a really good job representing like sort of air combat at the tactical level, but it has a very strong focus on the air combat at the tactical level focus. So it doesn't do other domains really well, or at all. Any other questions from the crowd? I have a couple others that were sent to me directly. So Kevin, what are your thoughts about negative learning and sort of like groupthink when you run these interactive TDGs or TDGs in general?
So negative learning is so I just have a different perspective on wargaming. I think if wargaming is about exploring ideas, you know, yes, you could come away with negative results and negative outcomes and maybe negative learning points, but that's largely on the facilitator, I think. I think even when things go wrong, it's kind of on the onus of the facilitator to point those out and have a discussion about it. If you're talking about negative learning because a digital simulation may not model something accurately, that just kind of goes back to what's the purpose of running these TDGs. So if the purpose of running the TDGs is to train somebody in the MOS field, I may actually use something like Command PE, even though it's more complicated, just because I know the modeling is probably closer than something like Sea Power or Cold Waters. Um, that's kind of my opinion on negative learning. I think it's largely up to the facilitator. When it comes to groupthink, um, if you're talking about one person kind of taking the lead and nobody else learning, that's one thing. If you're talking about everybody coming up with the same idea because it's like an echo chamber, that's another. And I think the answer in both cases is you just make them on an individual level and you make them like the way I did it was an email submission where I had people upload the documents directly on a platform. I didn't make it an in-person thing. If you were going to make it an in-person thing, then I would stick to maybe making it a team effort, splitting people up into groups of four, for instance. That way, at least maybe you get different groups coming up with different ideas, and then you can have a more in-depth discussion than maybe half the class coming up with the same COA. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it does. Another question I see here is how do you see it? Of course, there's never a webinar that's not mentioning AI these days. Is how do you see these interactive TDGs evolving with AI and other tools?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of different ways. Like, so the good ways, on Good Guy Team is hopefully we'll be able to be at a place where we can have maybe an intuitive war game that's easy for players to use with an autonomous AI agent, and that agent doing staff functions. That way we could maybe have some solo reps and sets actually happening for majors and above instead of just sitting around a table for 3 days, maybe going through 3 turns. Um, the other use case is I don't. So when people say AI, it's kind of like a broad net. But I also include things like generative AI in the broader net of AI. So like generative AI should make facilitators' lives easier. I always think there should be a human in the loop, but I already use large language models for some of my war game scenario designs and not to trust them 100%, but to like get me 80% of the way there and then research and fact check and make my decisions from there. So I see it also helping the workflow. On the negative side, I can also envision a space where there are TDGs being made en masse to try to open source inputs about like again, if wargaming is just about exploring ideas, then the most important thing is your thought process. Um, so again, that may never happen, but I do kind of see an opportunity and a gap for somebody to exploit the technologies in that way. Not trying to get like some classified data, but again, just trying to understand the thought processes. You could imagine even like maybe a foreign policy TDG at like the Elliott School of International Affairs or something, just targeting students and saying, okay, how are they actually thinking for the next generation? Um, so yeah, there's a couple different ways, I think.
Tracking. One person has asked any suggestions for professional certifications or courses in wargaming.
So if you're European, I would say King's College. They have a really good board gaming degree, actually. I'm not sure the length of it. They have one, and then the other one I'll recommend is the Moore's Wargaming certificate. Full disclosure, though, I have not taken it just because I don't. have the cash to go take it, but I've heard good things about it. But those are the only two that I'm really aware of. I'm sure there's others, but those are the only two that I know people who have personally taken them. And that's MORS. I'll type it in the chat.
Um, so I will not beleaguer this, so I'll give anyone any last minute chances to toss in any questions for Kevin and his presentation on interactive TDGs. But Kevin, while we wait for that, do you have any last minute comments or thoughts, soapboxes you want to jump on and tell us about your views on wargaming or digital wargaming writ large?
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat. So if you want the slide deck, or if you didn't get the link earlier for the Wargaming guide, just reach out to me, even if you have questions. Don't really have a soapbox other than hire more young people. Please take chances on people without degrees. They can be fantastic assets to your organization. Um, yeah, and the other thing is if the vulnerabilities and exploitation of digital wargaming interests you, and you want to have a more professional conversation about it, I would love to talk to people about it because that's kind of like my crazy conspiracy theory I'm working on in the background. And
Seeing
that's
no,
it.
seeing no questions, Kevin, on behalf of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, we want to thank you for your time and your expertise and sharing your Tuesday evening with us. And to our audience, thank you for the wonderful questions and being engaged as part of our wider Georgetown University Wargaming Society community. Have a good evening, everyone, and see you next time.